Thank you. Apologies for my hyperbolic title, but it's meant somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also with affection. Your beautiful mind in chains. Let's start out first with a little anecdote. Lars Gustafsson, the Swedish novelist, short story writer, poet, philosopher, taught at UT Austin for many years. Once, when my wife asked him, how did he write the great story, Greatness Strikes Where It Pleases, because it's an amazing story. And Lars said, yes, how did I do it? and perhaps one of his more abstract statements about craft, he said in class one time about writing stories, you must find the black hole to which everything is attracted. Well, what do I know about craft in writing fiction? I suppose I know a fair amount, yet usually when I begin a new story or novel, what I know feels about as useful to me as the ability to walk as to a person about to cross a vast desert landscape, not knowing yet where the water holes may lie. I confess to not thinking about craft when I begin a story, instead thinking about the characters not as characters but as people, the situation not as story or plot but as situation. I think simply about sentences, sound, tone, the one thing after another. I think about the pleasure of the work, or try to. Things were said by others to me and by myself to me and to others. Things such as a story cannot just be a dream. Point of view is the first and most important decision to make when beginning a story, and more like a determination, since the material plus your mind or imagination probably already know at some level what that should be. No sentence in a good story is doing only one thing. Dialogue should not be used generally for exposition. Good dialogue is as much about what's not being said as about what is said. There must be a reason for this particular story being told now, by or through this particular person. Scene makes the dramatic action, brings it into realistic focus for the reader. Language may be beautiful, but it may not be beautiful at the expense of evading character development, the collision of characters and events, and the frequent ugliness of real life. The revisionary mind must be capable of murder, arson, rape, and much more. There is never only one way to tell a story until there is, and many more. I once changed the point of view of a story troubling me from third person limited to first person, and not one of the original characters or events survived. Only the setting survived. The changing of the point of view was a matter of craft. The evolution of one set of characters and events into oblivion and another into life was not craft, but some nicer result of its application. Every one of you in here knows enough about craft to write a good book. But you came here because you want to write a great book, something you might even blushingly think of as art. You didn't just want to write a well-crafted book. Even if it embarrasses you to say so in reference to yourself or what you do, you want to make art. That's your problem. And we're all here to help nurse you through it. Craft is not only a set of tools and the knowledge of how to use them and the acquisition of great experience at using them, as the word most strongly implies. It is also the portal to the art of that particular craft, the art it is potentially possible to achieve through the mastery of the elements of craft. This is maybe why some of us develop a somewhat disdainful attitude toward the discussion of craft. It's why Joy Williams' craft talk begins with the words, craft, 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 in a most disdainful voice. I fear I've done some of my most creative writing when I have answered questions about how a particular story came together on the page. Do I remember what was going on when I was deeply in that story, speeding on it, lost in it to the expense of almost everything else? I doubt it, rarely at best. I'm not interested in those moments, in recording the process, even in little pockets of my own memory. Think about the fundamental elements of craft and fiction. Character, including description, internal life or consciousness or monologue, dialogue. Point of view, including description, landscape, atmosphere, mood, tone, etc. Setting, including description, landscape, atmosphere, mood, tone, etc. Scene and narrative. Here you're creating a marriage of the two every time, a marriage that is inspired at a dance. Plot, unity, reading as a writer. Theme, for lack of a more graceful and interesting term. But is theme craft, or is theme something that emerges as an artful element from the judicious and deeply embedded, masterful use of craft? Probably so. The textbooks on writing that are good are not good. Until you have read them, put them down, and then add the catalysts of reading a story or novel in which you see what the book was talking about actually taking place, or in a story you were writing, maybe, when you attempt to do what the book was talking about. Only then does the abstract become concrete for you, the writer. Without the stories themselves, the ones you read as attentively as a demolition expert attends to the defusing of a bomb, and the ones you actually attempt to write. Without them, the writing books and the writing talks are as useless as a wise parent's advice on marriage before the marriage. But afterwards, many things the wise parent said will flock down to roost in that marriage like a tree full of shrewd, articulate, haunting crows. A little aside, once when I was 17 working odd jobs in Los Angeles, I was required to assist an old plasterer for the day. He was an irascible drunk. He verbally abused me all day. He was an unhappy man. He was also an excellent plasterer, very fast and very smooth. He was a perfectionist. At the end of the day, we loaded his tools, hoses, and so on, into the truck, washed out the mixer, and drove back to the shop. We stopped at a busy intersection, waiting for the light, and a battered white truck similar to his with an identical plaster-spattered mixer trailing it rattled through the intersection. The plasterer took a heavy hit on his viceroy and said, "There goes damn fool." I said, "Do you know him?" He gave me the look you give an idiot and said, "Anybody's a plasterer's a damn fool." I can't say just why the plasterer was such a bitterly unhappy man. Maybe because he could never make enough money no matter how hard he worked. Maybe he never realized when he was young that for the rest of his working life, he would get up in the morning and, have to do it all over again. Maybe he'd lost the ability to see the beauty in the building he was helping create and could only see the very wall before him at that moment. Maybe it was only sand, plaster mix, water, and trowel, not beautifully plaster-sculpted wall. Maybe, like the hunger artist in Kafka's story, he'd always wanted us to admire his plastering, but no one seemed to, really. And his vision had spiraled down into the myopic. Maybe he was haunted by the idea that he was an expert but unappreciated craftsman, not an underappreciated artist. I don't know. Maybe he was just tired, dragging along what had become his great length of chain. I understand that now. One thing's certain, though, there was no mystery in it for him anymore. There was none of the mysterious discovery or revelation that arises from the artful application of craft, if he'd ever had that. In my craft class, we focused on an exercise involving imitation, an exercise adapted from one made up by R.V. Castle. I think a lot of craft exercises involve imitation of some sort, even if they don't call it that. It used to be, and probably still is, the way we all learn to work. We attempted an exact structural imitation of a Christine Scutt story, the goals being a deeper appreciation for the finer points of the original writing. a refreshing of the mental energy that constantly configures the architecture of our words, sentences, and paragraphs, a cleansing of the creative palette, and a loosening of the locks upon the gates of what too often become our creative cages. None other than Eudora Welty has said that such exercises are not real or actual writing. Imitation, she said, or what is in any respect secondhand, is precisely what writing is not. It is craft, we might interject, or at least a certain practice of craft. But Welty says that fiction is full of mystery, more so than we can even adequately describe. She said, "The mystery lies in the use of language to express human life." So the use of my exercise adapted from Castle's is simply to break down a certain amount and kind of resistance to the mystery. Its use is to open the first gate or door, if that door happens to seem stuck, to an endless hallway or infinite space. It can be used to get under the skin of another writer's work, to force your way intimately inside of it, so that you're seeing the craft of it as much from the inside as possible, and in that way, you are closest to seeing its art. In addition to a whole lot of careful reading, it takes a whole lot of writing, a whole lot of sitting there writing or typing out stories or poems. I don't know if you've seen the documentary with Harry Crews where he opens a filing cabinet and it's full of folders, and he says, "To hell with the writing, just think of all the damn typing that went into this." But you write a lot of stories, and you'll write some bad ones and then some better ones, and it is astonishing how much better they have to be than you think when you begin. The writer who doesn't think his or her first work is good before realizing it's probably not is rare. In my third year in graduate school, I finally got sick and tired of living with all the bad stories I'd written between the age of 19 and the age I was then, 26. Most of these bad stories had actually been written between the ages of 19 and 22 when I was in college. I wrote a lot of stories in those years, and almost all of them were very bad. I kept these stories in a box that reams of typing paper came in. One of those boxes that holds something like 10 or 12 reams of paper. And now the box had almost that much paper in it, except all the paper was covered with typing that represented the worst stories I could possibly write. The box lived in the closet off my apartment's living room like an indigent relative. And since this closet also held my clothing, I had to confront this box of stinking stories every morning when I dressed to go out. The box of manuscripts possessed great telepathic power. It had a power like the monkey in Haruki Murakami's story, A Shinagawa Monkey, except that instead of purporting to steal only people's names, this box was openly stealing my imagination and confidence. It was horrible enough that I, like most aspiring writers, had written so many awful stories. But it was much worse that these stories continued to sit there in my closet and remind me every day just how bad a writer I could be. So one day I carried the box of bad stories downstairs and into the backyard, where I set them down and poured a jug of kerosene over them as they sat there in the box, rather malevolently, I thought. I struck a kitchen match into flame, tossed it onto the box of bad stories, and stepped back, expecting it to become an instant inferno. I should have used gasoline. This was summertime in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a very humid time and place. And these stories had been sitting on top of one another, compressing all air from between their pages, day after day for years now. And so instead, when the match hit the top of the sack of stories, a gentle wave of blue ethereal flame rolled over the surface of the top pages, and down the sides of the stacks of stories, and traveled back up and began to burn the page atop each of the two stacks from its outer edges in, extracting moisture from the entire page before finally consuming it with flame. The effect was to cause each page to shrink slowly into a miniature version of itself. With correspondingly miniature type, before succumbing entirely to flame, whereupon the next page, the one directly underneath the just burned one, would go through the exact same process. This is true. I realized I could scan quickly each page as it shrank. And as I leaned over the slow, methodical destruction of some 4 years' earnest work and read each page quickly as it was consumed, I was able to confirm with a sense of forlorn justification just how bad all the writing really was. And so with each page as I read it, I thought, yeah, that's awful. It took about 2 hours. Dusk crept in. The weird flickering blue flames glowed in the tiny backyard. And then finally, it was over. The manuscripts were gone. It was time to write more stories, better ones. It's time to stop obsessively rethinking my failed work and read more great work. Time for a greater and freer immersion into the mystery. Craft. Craft. That which we first learn and grapple ecstatically until we realize we have become somehow bogged in it. How do we then make the leap from craftsman to something more like artist? One of the most mysterious and brilliant, moving, and terrifying stories I've read is Joy Williams' story, The Farm. That's the Joy Williams of craft, 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 craft. The Farm has been recognized as one of the best stories written by an American in the past 30 years. I say one of the best ever. It's an unconventional, slightly surreal story that dares to tease you with the ironically conventional, even cliched first sentence, "It was a dark night in August." The main character, Sarah, is a woman who has lived her entire life avoiding not thought, but at least any sort of rigorous self-awareness, out of some sort of undefined fear, which she tries to evade or obscure with booze. Her life seemed so remote to her. She had sought happiness in someone, knowing she could not find it in herself, and now her heart was strangely hard. She's out on a party round robin with her husband, who is on his every other weekend habit of not drinking. Their marriage is apparently stable, but in reality, it's a marriage of non-communication and distrust. She writes, "Over the years, Sarah suspects Tommy has floated to the surface of her. They are swimmers now, far apart, on top of the sea. Sarah, though she is the one drinking, is the one driving them from party to party. They've had an argument. It becomes apparent that her husband, Tommy, is an adulterer, a passively faithful husband with affairs on the side, taking advantage of his wife's alcoholic fog to get away with it. But it's not that simple. There is also implicit in the story a kind of fatalism that exists between them, one that allows them to stay married while maintaining their mutual fatalisms. Hers is mired in her inability to feel anything because she is habitually afraid to. Earlier, when she witnesses Tommy in a seductive flirtation with a younger woman at a party, she wishes most that she had not seen it at all. His is a fatalistic commitment to caring for her despite the obvious imperviousness of her condition. Later that night, as they are traveling from one party to the next, Sarah hits and kills a young man standing in the middle of a dark rural road. I quote the story. The road was dark and silvery and straight. In the space ahead of her, there seemed to be something. It beckoned, glittering. Sarah's mind cleared a little. She saw, in her mind, their daughter, Martha, with her hair cut oddly short. Sarah gently nibbled on the inside of her mouth to keep alert. She saw Tommy choosing a succession of houses, examining the plaster, the floorboards, the fireplaces, deciding where windows should be placed, walls knocked down. She saw herself taking curtains down from a window so that there would be a better view of the sea. The curtains knocked her glass from the sill, and it shattered. The sea was white and flat. It did not command her to change life. It demanded of her nothing. She saw Martha sleeping, her paint-smudged fingers curled. She saw Tommy in the city with a woman, riding in a cab. The woman wore a short fur jacket, and Tommy stroked it as he spoke. She saw a figure in the road ahead, its arms raised high before his face, as though to block out the sight of her. The figure was a boy who wore dark clothing, but his hair was bright, his face was shining. She saw her car leap forward and run him down where he stood. Tommy, sober, claims he was driving, takes the blame, and for a while Sarah's crime seems to have been hidden, masked, in the same way that they habitually mask the emptiness of their relationship. After the accident, after she has stopped drinking as a result, Sarah thinks, there is a certain type of conversation one hears only when one is drunk, and it is like a dream, full of humor and threat and significance, deep significance. And the way one witnesses things when one is drunk is different as well. It is like putting a face mask against the surface of the sea and looking into things, into their baffled and guileless hearts. When Sarah had been a drinker, she felt that she had a fundamental and inventive grasp of situations. But now that she drank no longer, she found herself in the midst of a great and impenetrable silence which she could in no way interpret. She spent years drinking far too much all the time, and now she realizes sober that she and Tommy have never had anything to talk about, ever, and that this has been masked by the drinking. In her earlier sober drinking period that she had, she said that sometimes she would silently count as Tommy spoke to see how long the words took. When he was away and he telephoned her, she could hear the ice tinkling in the glass. Sober, she recalls a birthday when they went to New York to see a play, got drunk on the way down, argued. She tried to drive back home alone, but couldn't find her way back out of the city. The story. Sarah drove carefully for many blocks. When she had the opportunity, she would pull to the curb and ask someone how to get to Connecticut. No one seemed to know. Sarah thought she was probably phrasing the question poorly, but she didn't know how else to present it. After half an hour, she made her way back to the hotel where Tommy was staying. Well, they make blind, drunken love in the hotel room, never make it to the play, and she wakes up alone in the room with hardly any memory of what has happened the night before. Here the story reads, the room was a mess, although Sarah could see that nothing had really been damaged. She stared at the television, where black-backed gulls were dive-bombing on terrified and doomed cygnets in a documentary about swans. Sarah crept into the bathroom and turned on the shower. She sat in the tub while the water beat upon her. Pinned to the outside of the shower curtain was a note from Tommy, who had gone to work. Darling, the note said, we had a good time on your birthday. I can't say I'm sorry we never got out. I'll call you for lunch. Love. Sarah turned the note inward until the water made the writing illegible. When the phone rang just before noon, she did not answer it. Williams continually demonstrates to us Sarah's deep sense of disorientation, her disconnection from reality, such as her resurfaced memory alluded to in the accident scene, but which fully resurfaces after the accident, of something awful she once did to her daughter, Martha. The story again. Sarah stopped drinking immediately after the accident. She felt nauseated much of the time. She slept poorly. Her hands hurt her. The bones in her hands ached. She remembered that this was the way she felt the last time she had stopped drinking. It had been 2 years before. She remembered why she had stopped, and she remembered why she had started again. She had stopped because she had done a cruel thing to her little Martha. It was spring, and she and Tommy were giving a dinner party. Sarah had 2 martinis in the late afternoon when she was preparing dinner, and then she had 2 more martinis with her guests. Martha had come downstairs to say a polite good night to everyone as she had been taught. She had put on her nightie and brushed her teeth. Sarah poured a little more gin in her glass and went upstairs with her to brush out her hair and put her to bed. Martha had long, thick, blonde hair, of which she was very proud. On that night, she wore it in a ponytail, secured by an elastic holder with 2 small colored balls on the end. Sarah's fingers were clumsy, and she could not get it off without pulling Martha's hair and making her cry. She got a pair of scissors and carefully began snipping at the stubborn elastic. The scissors were large, like shears, and they had been difficult to handle. A foot of Martha's gathered hair had abruptly fallen to the floor. Sarah remembered trying to pat it back into place on the child's head. After Sarah has entered into her current, transformative, and dazzlingly confused period, her terrifying new period of sobriety, which feels like a dream wherein the air is like painfully oversensitive skin, she is visited one morning, while Tommy and her daughter are gone, by the mother of the boy she ran over and killed. Genevieve just shows up, and Sarah just lets her in. The story. The 2 women sat in Sarah's handsome, sunny living room, Williams writes. It was very calm, very peculiar, almost thrilling. I did not want my life to know you, Genevieve said. She removed a hair from the front of her white blouse and dropped it to the floor. She looked out the window at the sun. The floor was of a very light and varnished pine. Sarah could see the hair upon it. A nice demonstrable echo of the hair lopping incident there. We are not strangers to one another, Genevieve said. We could be friends. It is not appropriate that we be friends, Sarah said. Genevieve continued to sit and talk. Sarah found herself concentrating desperately on her articulate, one-sided conversation. She suspected that the words Genevieve was using were codes for other words, terrible words. Genevieve spoke thoughtlessly, dispassionately, with erratic flourishes of language. Sarah couldn't believe that they were chatting about food, men, the red clouds massed above the sea. It's a strange visit by a strange and obviously grieving and possibly sadistic woman. A woman who locks the door behind her when she visits and says, well, even her son Stevie used to break into houses sometimes. It soon has become stranger when Sarah and the reader realize that Genevieve knows Sarah was the actual driver who killed her son. You're the drinker, aren't you? And that what she wants in exchange is for Sarah to share her and Tommy's daughter with her in the absence of her son, the son they killed. Sarah, already an alcoholic, fearful person, unable to care for herself or her child very well, seems ready to acquiesce to this bizarre and frightening request. How could she even consider such a suggestion? Throughout the story, we've been given many clues, signs, information, language showing us this, if you will, accompanied by language that describes her inner life, a form of telling. Language indicating that Sarah is someone who has no ability or even the will to control her own life, and that this woman coming in and directing her to effectively hand her life over to her is some kind of fatalistic savior. The despair embedded in the details of the hotel room scene is laid achingly bare when she dissolves the words written on the note. The hopeless elation of oblivion is exposed in all its stark inadequacy when the daughter's lopped-off hair falls to the floor. Before the accident between parties, Sarah wonders, had they talked about divorce that night, or had that been before on other evenings? When a friend at one party tells Sarah she has beautiful eyes, quote, she moved away from him immediately. She closed her eyes. Williams uses language with its attendant skillful manipulation of craft to arrive at the terrible beauty and mystery of the whole business. A deft manipulation of craft leaves room for the transcendent quality of her vision to bleed into the story in moments and scenes made possible only by the construction of spaces laid open for it. Her mind, Williams writes early on, was an untidy cupboard filled with shining bottles. Williams' masterful use of craft plus the extraordinary clarity of her vision, ironically, a vision of extremes, the deep fog of mental and spiritual confusion, and the terrifying clarity of the psychological landscape revealed when the fog lifts. These make The Farm a great story. The point of view could not possibly be any other than Sarah's here. It is her story. This story is like a nightmare, but it is most definitely real. The dialogue between Sarah and Genevieve is revelatory, not expository. It is much about what is not being said. There is only one really big scene in here, along with several recalled, fragmented, or momentary ones leading to it, and it brings everything into focus. The beautiful metaphorical sentence, "Her mind was an untidy cupboard filled with shining bottles," is all about character. And in this story, all characters, all events collide, literally and figuratively. There is craft here to burn. But the ending is much more than just craftful. Tommy tells Sarah they should get away from this place and that woman and from what happened. But Sarah can no longer even hear him. Everything has changed, she says. There are robbers. The more vivid and riveting the showing, the craft, if you will, the more powerful the artful telling when you come to it. The more precise the detail and description, the more powerful the interpretive language that may emerge from it. Our sense of what the story is finally all about has been gathering, like some great invisible field of energy behind, beyond, or invisibly within the story's visible field. At some moment, the confluence of its forces is upon us, and we are in it. The black hole in this story is death, first physical, ultimately spiritual, and there is the simultaneous recognition of this in Sarah and the reader. The black hole in your story may or may not be as dire as death, but it must be something powerful, and often is not something powerful enough to be inarticulate in your mind until you have finished writing and can come back to the story as a coherent, normal person, which you may not be while you are in the early grip of writing it. But you move closer to the coherent center. With every moment, you carefully lay words, sentences, images, metaphor, true, possibly strange dialogue onto the page, adding layer of meaning, significance, insight. And what is insight but the surprise recognition of connections between or among things? This sense of what it is all about is growing slowly more evident as a presence. You are learning to recognize it even as you lay this down and that. So read all the books on craft you like, but of course they are useless unless you also read great stories and novels, to state the obvious. And read them with the mind and experience gathering as much along the way as you can of a writer, all the while trying to write something just as great yourself. Most of the time you'll fail or think you failed to write a story as great as the one you envisioned. And nothing to do then but set your story aside. Or hell, send it out. Get another opinion. There's no need to burn it just yet. And then read something great, like The Farm or any other great story, and see again that it can be done. And try again.